They say home is where the heart is, but on that Thanksgiving, my heart was a broken mess, shattered into a million pieces. My own folks, my parents, had left me high and dry, celebrating without me. It felt like a punch to the gut, a betrayal so deep it stole my breath. I was all alone, feeling lower than a snake's belly. But then, just when I thought I was down for the count, someone walked in who turned my whole world upside down. My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer from my small, cozy house on the outskirts of a town that prides itself on its quiet, tree-lined streets. It's the kind of place where autumn doesn't just arrive, it settles in like an old friend, painting the maple trees in fiery shades of crimson and gold. Unlike the electric pulse of a big city, my town has a rhythm that's measured by the changing seasons and the familiar faces you see at the local farmer's market. Yet for all its charm, on that particular Thanksgiving morning, the silence in my house felt vast and unwelcoming. I'd always been what you might call an old soul, someone who found comfort in tradition. Thanksgiving, for me, was the crown jewel of the year, a day steeped in the aroma of roasting turkey and my mother's famous pecan pie, a day that hummed with the chaotic, beautiful energy of family. I woke up that morning before the sun had even thought about stretching its golden arms over the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a cold, clear day. I padded into the kitchen, my mind already a whirlwind of timings and temperatures. The 20-pound turkey I'd bought, a behemoth of a bird, was resting in the sink, ready for its date with destiny. My grandmother's china was stacked on the counter, each plate a fragile memory of Thanksgiving's past. I had it all planned out. I'd handle the bird and the stuffing, my dad would be on carving duty, and my mom, well, she was the master of the last-minute details that turned a meal into a feast. I imagined the house filled with the warm, overlapping sounds of their voices, the clatter of silverware, the football game droning on in the living room. It was a picture I had painted in my mind 1,000 times, a scene of belonging that I clung to like a life raft. I was in the middle of wrestling the turkey into the roasting pan when they came downstairs. My mother, Ellen, was already dressed in a cashmere sweater the color of oatmeal, her movements efficient and precise. My father, Richard, followed behind, scrolling through something on his phone, his face illuminated by the cool blue light. They moved around me in a practiced dance, pouring coffee, grabbing their coats. It was all so normal, so routine, that the bombshell, when it dropped, felt like it came from another universe entirely. "Oh, honey, don't go to too much trouble with all that," my mother said, gesturing vaguely at my turkey wrestling efforts. Her voice had that breezy, dismissive quality it took on when she was about to deliver news I wouldn't like. I paused, my hands slick with butter and herbs. "What do you mean? Dad's not even going to complain about my stuffing this year?" I said, trying for a light, teasing tone. My dad looked up from his phone, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before it was gone. "Actually, kiddo," he started, the nickname feeling oddly hollow, "your Aunt Carol invited us over. Last-minute thing. You know how she gets." The air in the kitchen seemed to thin, the familiar scent of cinnamon and nutmeg suddenly feeling cloying and artificial. Aunt Carol lived 2 states away. A last-minute thing? My mind reeled, trying to make the pieces fit. My mother swooped in to fill the silence. "It's just going to be us adults this year, a really small, quiet thing," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We didn't want to bore you with all our old people talk. Just us adults." The words hung in the air, each one a tiny, poisoned dart. Was 32 years old. I paid a mortgage. I ran my own business. I was, by every conceivable definition, an adult. The excuse was so flimsy, so transparently false, it was worse than no excuse at all. It was a slap in the face. It was a kick in the teeth. It was a clear, unvarnished message: you are not wanted here. I remember the feeling, a cold dread creeping up from my stomach, wrapping around my heart and squeezing. It was the same feeling I'd had as a 7-year-old, standing alone at the edge of the schoolyard, watching all the other kids get picked for a team. The feeling of being fundamentally, inexplicably left out. I tried to be a good sport. I forced a smile that felt like it was cracking my face in two. "Oh," I managed, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. "Okay, well, that sounds nice. You guys have fun." My mother patted my arm, a quick, transactional gesture devoid of any real warmth. "We will, sweetie. Don't worry. We'll save you some of Carol's pie. You know how you love her pie." They were out the door a few minutes later, a flurry of car keys and last-minute instructions about the thermostat, leaving a wake of silence that was more deafening than any shouting match could ever be. The front door clicked shut, and the sound echoed through the house, a final, definitive period at the end of a sentence I hadn't even known was being written. Have you ever felt completely left out, even by the people who are supposed to be closest to you? What did you do? I stood there for a long time, staring at the raw turkey in its pan, a monument to a celebration that would never happen. The grand dinner I thought we'd share, the laughter, the love, it all dissolved into a void where my family should have been. The kitchen, which had felt so full of promise just an hour before, now felt like a mausoleum. I looked around at the pristine china, the unmade stuffing, the lonely bird, and a single, crushing thought landed in my gut. I thought, this is it. This is rock bottom. But oh boy, was I ever wrong about that. The hours that followed stretched out into an eternity of silence. The morning sun crept across the kitchen floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny spotlight on my solitude. At first, I just sat at the kitchen table, motionless, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick was a small hammer blow, marking another second that I was completely and utterly alone. The sheer weight of the quiet was suffocating. On any other day, I cherished the peace of my little house, but today it felt like a prison. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. It amplified every doubt, every insecurity I had ever harbored. Around noon, a gnawing hunger finally pushed me to my feet. The enormous turkey seemed to mock me from its roasting pan. Cooking it now would be an act of profound self-pity, a feast for one that would only highlight the emptiness of the other chairs around my dining room table. I couldn't bear it. Instead, I unwrapped a single chicken breast, seasoned it with a joyless shake of salt and pepper, and put it in a pan. The sizzle of the chicken hitting the hot oil was a jarring intrusion into the stillness, a sound so small yet so loud in the cavernous quiet. I made a small mound of instant mashed potatoes, the kind that comes from a box, a pale imitation of the creamy, buttery mountain my dad and I usually made together. I ate standing up at the counter, the clinking of my single fork against the plate, the only sound in the house. There was no joyful chaos, no laughter, no one to argue with about whether the dark meat was better than the white. There was just me and the bland, mechanical act of chewing and swallowing. With every bite, questions churned in my stomach like acid. Am I not good enough? Did I do something wrong? My mind, a cruel tormentor, began to play a highlight reel of Thanksgiving's past. I saw myself as a little girl perched on a stool, helping my mom by clumsily peeling potatoes, flour dusting my nose. I saw myself as a teenager, rolling my eyes at my dad's terrible jokes, but secretly loving them. I remembered the year I brought my college boyfriend home, the way my parents had welcomed him, making him feel like one of the family. Those memories, once a source of warmth and comfort, now felt like a knife in the gut. They were ghosts of a life I thought I had, a family I thought I belonged to. The contrast between that vibrant past and this cold, sterile present was a physical ache in my chest. It wasn't just that they had left, it was that they had erased me, had decided that their Thanksgiving picture was complete and I simply wasn't in it. The phone rang around 3 o'clock, the sudden shrill sound making me jump. It was my mother. I saw her name on the screen, and for a foolish, hopeful second, my heart leaped. Maybe they were on their way back. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But her voice on the other end of the line dashed that hope to pieces. "Hi, honey. Just wanted to call and say Happy Thanksgiving," she chirped. In the background, I could hear a cacophony of cheerful noise, laughter, the clinking of glasses, my Aunt Carol's booming voice telling some story. They were having the time of their lives. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," I said, my voice flat. "Everything okay? What are you up to?" she asked, the question a perfunctory tick on her to-do list. There was no real concern in her tone, no genuine curiosity about my lonely plight. She was just making the obligatory call. "I'm fine, just relaxing," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, to confess that I was sitting alone, eating boxed potatoes, and feeling my world crumble. It would have been met with a breezy, "Oh, don't be so dramatic," or worse, a placating promise to make it up to me, a promise I knew would be forgotten by morning. "Okay, great. Well, your Aunt Carol's pie is to die for this year. We'll try to save you a piece. Love you." And then she was gone, the line going dead, leaving me in a silence that was even heavier than before. That brief, hollow call didn't bridge the distance between us. It carved the canyon even deeper. It was confirmation that I wasn't just forgotten, I was an afterthought. The wound, already gaping, was now salted. What's the loneliest you've ever felt on a holiday, and how did you push through it? I slumped down at the dining room table, the one I had so carefully set for 3 people that morning. I picked at the remnants of my sad meal, the dry piece of chicken, the lumpy potatoes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the room. I felt a profound weariness settle over me, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with being tired. It was the exhaustion of a lifetime of trying to be enough, of trying to earn a place that should have been mine by birthright. I felt lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. Just as I was about to throw in the towel, push the plate away, and call it the worst Thanksgiving of my life, that old screen door on the back porch creaked open. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in the crushing silence of the afternoon, that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. It was a familiar sound, a groan of old wood and rusted springs that I associated with summer evenings and the smell of freshly cut grass. Then I heard footsteps, slow and steady, crossing the porch and heading for the kitchen door. My heart hammered against my ribs. My first thought was that my parents had come back, that their consciences had finally gotten the better of them. A part of me, the part that was still a hopeful child, wanted to run to the door. But another, wiser part of me knew it wasn't them. Their footsteps were always hurried, always purposeful. These were different. The kitchen door pushed open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the fading light. He was holding something in a pie dish, a dish I recognized instantly. It was my grandmother's old ceramic dish, the one with a small chip on the rim, and the man holding it was my Grandpa Joe. He stepped into the light, and the sight of him was like a shot in the arm. His silver hair was a little unruly from the wind, his face a roadmap of laugh lines, and his eyes held a knowing twinkle that could see right through you. In his other hand, he carried a large pot from which a plume of fragrant steam was rising. I just stared, completely dumbstruck. "Grandpa, what are you doing here?" My voice came out as a squeak. He set the pie and the pot down on the counter and looked around the quiet kitchen, his gaze taking in the single dirty plate, the massive uncooked turkey, and the hollow look on my face. "Well," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble, "I called your folks' house to wish them a happy Thanksgiving, and your mother told me they were off at Carol's. Sounded like a real hootenanny over there." He paused, his eyes settling on me. Then I asked her where you were, and she got real quiet for a second. Said you were taking it easy at home. He let out a small, dry chuckle, and I thought to myself, "Joe, that don't sound like my Sarah, not on Thanksgiving." The dam broke. The tears I had been choking back all day finally spilled over, hot and silent, tracing paths down my cheeks. I didn't even try to hide them. He didn't rush to hug me or offer empty platitudes. He just stood there, letting me have my moment, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in my swirling sea of misery. After a minute, he pulled a chair out from the table and patted the seat. "Looks like you could use a friend, kiddo," he said gently. "You looked a little down in the mouth when I walked in." The simple, honest acknowledgement of my pain was more comforting than any flowery words could ever be. I sat down, and he began to unpack his offerings. The pie was still warm, a perfect golden-crusted apple pie, my absolute favorite. The pot contained his famous mashed potatoes, whipped so light and fluffy they were like edible clouds, with a small lake of melted butter already forming in the center. He hadn't been invited by my parents. He hadn't been part of their plan. He had simply heard a single wrong note in my mother's voice, and he had known. He had packed up his 2 best dishes and driven 45 minutes, a culinary cavalry arriving just in the nick of time. He was a breath of fresh air in a room that had become stale with sorrow. He found a clean plate, spooned a generous helping of potatoes onto it, and then looked at the sad little chicken breast I'd cooked. "Well, that won't do," he declared. He walked over to the turkey. No sense letting a perfectly good bird go to waste. Without another word, he set about preparing it, his movements practiced and efficient. As he worked, he filled the silence not with prying questions, but with light-hearted chatter. He told me about his neighbor's dog who had learned to open the garden gate, about a funny movie he'd seen on TV the night before. His folksy wisdom and gentle teasing instantly began to lift the heavy, oppressive air in the room. Who's your Grandpa Joe in your life? That one person who always seems to show up when you need them most. Soon, the house began to fill with the glorious, long-awaited aroma of roasting turkey. The silence was replaced by the comfortable sounds of Grandpa Joe pottering around the kitchen. It felt like Thanksgiving again. We sat at the kitchen table, eating his mashed potatoes while we waited for the bird to cook. He didn't push me to talk. He just sat with me, a quiet, reassuring presence that said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Finally, after we had both had a second helping of potatoes, he leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from lighthearted to serious. He looked at me, his gaze kind but firm, and the twinkle in his eye was replaced by a deep, unwavering concern. "All right," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Now, tell your old grandpa what the devil's going on here, because where I come from, family don't leave family high and dry on Thanksgiving." Sitting there, bathed in the warm glow of the kitchen light and the even warmer glow of my grandfather's unconditional love, I felt a sense of safety I hadn't realized I was so desperately missing. His question wasn't an accusation, it was an invitation to finally let go of the brave face I had been wearing all day. And so the story came tumbling out. I told him everything. I told him about waking up excited, about my plans for the perfect family dinner. I described the casual, almost cruel way my parents had dropped the news, their flimsy excuse about an adults-only gathering. I told him about the crushing silence of the house, the sad little meal I'd made for myself, and the hollow, perfunctory phone call from my mom, her cheerful voice a stark contrast to the despair I was feeling. As I spoke, the words were punctuated by a fresh wave of tears, but these weren't the silent, lonely tears from before. These were cathartic, a cleansing flood of all the hurt and confusion I'd been holding inside. Grandpa Joe just listened. He didn't interrupt, he didn't fidget. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on me, his head nodding slowly at certain points. He wasn't absorbing my words with judgment for my parents, but with a deep, weary understanding. It was as if he was hearing a story he already knew, just with a new chapter added. When I finally ran out of words, my voice hoarse, a heavy silence settled between us. But this silence was different from the one before. It was a shared silence, thick with unspoken empathy. He let out a long, slow sigh and took a sip of the coffee I'd made him. "A leopard don't change its spots overnight," he said, his voice a low murmur. He stared into his coffee cup for a moment, as if seeing a memory in the dark liquid. "Your parents, they're good people in a lot of ways, but they've always had a blind spot, a big one. They get so caught up in what things look like, the right parties, the right people, the right address, that they sometimes forget what things feel like." Hearing him say it, hearing my own jumbled feelings articulated so clearly and calmly, was like a key turning in a lock. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't being dramatic. This wasn't something I had imagined. This was a pattern, a behavior he had seen before. "They've done things like this before, haven't they?" I asked, the question barely a whisper. He nodded again, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "Oh yeah," he said. "Some folks just ain't got the sense God gave a goose when it comes to family. I remember one year, for my 70th birthday, they were supposed to take me out to that steakhouse I like. The day before, your mother called, said something had come up. A charity auction your father's boss was hosting. Very important for his career, she said. They sent me a fruit basket instead." He said it without a trace of bitterness, just a plain statement of fact. But in that simple story, I saw a reflection of my own pain, the feeling of being traded in for something or someone deemed more important. It was a stunning revelation. All my life, I had thought these slights were reserved for me, that there was some fundamental flaw in me that made me easy to cast aside. To realize that my grandfather, a man I considered to be the bedrock of our family, had been on the receiving end of the same casual neglect, it created a deeper, unexpected bond between us. It was like finding a missing piece of the puzzle of my own life. When have you had an honest, tough conversation that changed your perspective on a family member? We sat and talked for hours while the turkey roasted, its rich aroma finally chasing away the last ghosts of wine. Loneliness from the house. He shared other stories, small instances of his own run-ins with my parents' particular brand of forgetfulness. It wasn't a session of bad-mouthing. It was a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of a difficult truth. And with every story he told, I felt a little bit of the blame I had been carrying on my own shoulders begin to lift. As the evening started to wind down and the perfectly browned turkey rested on the counter, Grandpa Joe pulled out his old flip phone. It looked like a relic from another era. He stepped into the hallway and I could hear him speaking in low, hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, just the serious, determined cadence of his voice. After a few minutes, he came back into the kitchen, a sly grin playing on his lips. He hung up the phone with a decisive snap and looked at me, a familiar, mischievous twinkle back in his eye. "Well," he said, rubbing his hands together, "looks like your folks are gonna be in for a little surprise themselves. Tomorrow, we're gonna pay 'em a visit." The next morning, there was a feeling of nervous energy in the air, a stark contrast to the despair of the day before. The plan felt both terrifying and exhilarating. We weren't going over there to yell or to cause a scene. Grandpa Joe had been very clear about that. "You don't win a war by screaming louder than the other fella," he'd said over breakfast. "You win by making him see he was fighting on the wrong side to begin with." We packed up a container of leftover turkey and a generous slice of his apple pie, an offering that felt more like a piece of evidence than a friendly gesture. The drive to my parents' immaculate suburban home was mostly silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we pulled into their driveway, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. This was their turf, their kingdom. I was used to feeling small here. My mother opened the door, her face a mask of polite surprise that quickly morphed into confusion when she saw Grandpa Joe standing behind me. "Dad, Sarah, what a surprise. We were just about to head out for some Black Friday shopping." She was already trying to manage the situation, to steer it back into the realm of the normal and non-confrontational. "We won't keep you long, Ellen," Grandpa said, his voice gentle but firm as he stepped past her into the foyer. My dad appeared from the living room, a newspaper in his hand, his expression mirroring my mother's. They led us into their pristine living room, a space that always felt more like a showroom than a place where people actually lived. We all sat down, the silence stretching uncomfortably. My mother started to ask about our Thanksgiving, a question so loaded with irony it was almost comical. But before she could finish, Grandpa Joe held up a hand. "Ellen, Richard," he began, his voice calm and measured, losing none of its power for its quietness. "We came here because there's something that needs saying." He looked from my mother to my father, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Sarah told me about your last-minute trip to Carol's, told me you two needed an adults-only holiday." My parents shifted in their seats. My mother's face flushed, a tide of defensiveness rising. "Dad, it wasn't like that. It was just a complicated thing, and we didn't want to—" "You didn't want to what?" Grandpa Joe interrupted, his voice still quiet but now laced with steel. "You didn't want to be inconvenienced? You didn't want to have to include your own daughter in your plans?" He leaned forward slightly. "I've been alive for 78 years. I've seen a lot of things, but I've learned that some things are more important than keeping up with the Joneses or keeping up appearances. And family, real family, is at the top of that list. What you two did yesterday, that wasn't right. You left your girl all alone on a day that's supposed to be about togetherness. You left her feeling like she was worth less than a trip out of town, and there's no excuse in the world good enough to cover that." He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't have to. He had put the fear of God into them with nothing but the quiet, profound weight of their own failure. They looked like they'd been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. My father stared at his shoes, unable to meet Grandpa's eyes. A glimmer of what looked like actual shame crossed my mother's face before she quickly masked it with a flustered expression. There was no dramatic, tearful apology. I didn't expect one. But there was a definite shift in the room's atmosphere. The air crackled with the unspoken truth. Then, Grandpa Joe, with a twinkle returning to his eye, delivered the final, masterful stroke. He looked at me, then back at them. "So, from now on, just so there's no confusion, Thanksgiving will be at my place, or Sarah's, and it will always include me, and it will always include her. No matter what other fancy invitations come your way. You're welcome to join us, of course, but the two of us," he gestured between me and himself, "we're a package deal. That's our new tradition." It was a declaration, a promise set in stone. In that moment, I felt so completely seen, so undeniably loved and protected that it took my breath away. He hadn't just stood up for me, he had built a fortress around me. What family tradition, old or new, means the absolute world to you? My parents were left sitting there, stunned into silence, contemplating their choices as Grandpa Joe and I stood up to leave. We walked out of that house, not hand in hand like children, but side by side as equals, a quiet victory warming our hearts. But as we drove away, the real question lingered in the crisp November air. Had they really learned their lesson, or was this just a bump in the road in their journey? In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself reflecting on that Thanksgiving, turning it over and over in my mind like a smooth gray stone. The wound from my parents' actions didn't magically heal. Some betrayals leave a scar that fades but never quite disappears, a faint, silvery line on your heart that reminds you of the break. It was a slow-burning fire, an ache that would sometimes flare up when I saw a family laughing together in a restaurant or when a holiday commercial came on TV. But my grandfather's love was a powerful balm, a soothing ointment that took the sting out of the burn. He had shown up, not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with a warm pie and an even warmer presence. He had sat with me in my darkness until the light came back on. That experience changed me. It was a painful, clarifying fire that burned away a lot of my childish illusions about my family. It made me realize, with a certainty that was both sad and liberating, who truly had my back. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn my parents' unconditional attention, contorting myself into a version of a daughter I thought they wanted. But on that lonely Thanksgiving, I learned that sometimes family isn't just about the blood that runs through your veins. It's about who shows up, rain or shine. It's about who brings you mashed potatoes when your world has fallen apart. It's about who sees you, truly sees you, and loves you not in spite of your cracks, but because of them. Our new Thanksgiving tradition became a legendary, cherished event. The following year, we gathered at Grandpa Joe's little house, the air thick with the competing, glorious smells of turkey and apple pie. My parents came, their demeanor subdued, a little more careful, a little more attentive. The relationship between us improved over time, but it was never quite the same. The easy, unthinking trust I once had in them was gone, replaced by a more cautious, realistic understanding of who they were. There was always that little something hanging in the air, the memory of that empty kitchen and their flimsy excuse. But that was okay. I had stopped needing them to be the heroes of my story, because I already had my hero. He was a 78-year-old man with flour on his shirt and a mischievous twinkle in his eye. He was a diamond in the rough. The memory of that lonely Thanksgiving still stings a bit when I let it, but it's always, always overshadowed by the warmth and unwavering love of Grandpa Joe. He didn't just save my holiday. In a way, he saved a part of me. He taught me that I was worthy of being someone's first choice, worthy of a seat at the table, no exceptions. And that, folks, is how a lonely Thanksgiving turned into a story about true family, and a grandpa who taught me that when life hands you lemons, sometimes a good old-fashioned hero shows up to help you make lemonade. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, who's your unexpected hero? I'm dying to know your stories. What's a lesson you learned the hard way about family or friendship?